Hey everybody, this is ASMR Angel Reads. I know last time we started chapter 2 and I was reviewing what happened in chapter 1, which I did a terrible job of. We were introduced to the four main characters, and Jill, being one, was living in a tavern with her mom when her mom died. Her father, Cullen, who's the main character, came and took her Jill with him. He cut her hair short and dressed her up like a boy. He's a soldier for hire. And then there's Nevin, who's the main character, is the old man who sells herbs to the poor people and helps them with their ailments. He's a powerful Dwemer master. Dwemer's what they call their magic, and Weird, W-Y-R-D, is their fate. And then at the very end of chapter 1, we met Rodri, who ends up with Cullen and Jill on the long road, and him and Jill end up together. So now let's continue on with chapter 2. When the day came for Prince Galron to ride back to court, that's Nevin, Garrett, that's Cullen, accompanied him for a few miles simply because he was expected to. The prince smiled and chatted until Garrett wanted to murder him and leave his body in the ditch by the road. At last they reached the turning, and Garrett sat on his horse and watched the prince's scarlet and white plaid coat disappear into the distance. 3 more weeks, only 3 more weeks, and the prince would return from Dundevry to take Bragawin, that's Jill, away. With her, Garrett's heart would go breaking. When he rode back to the Dun, Garrett found Bragawin sitting outside in the sun and sewing. And Garrett and Bragawin are brother and sister in this life. He gave his horse to Brythu, his page, and sat down at her feet like a dog. Her golden hair shone in the sun like fine-spun thread, wisping around the soft skin of her cheeks. When she smiled at him, Garrett felt stabbed to the heart. "What are you sewing?" Garrett said. "Somewhat for your dower chest?" "It's not but a shirt for you, the last one I'll ever make, but don't worry, Yasala does splendid needlework. I'll wager that your wedding shirt is ever so much nicer than my poor Galrion's." Garrett rose to his feet, hesitated, then sat again, trapped in his old torment, that his beautiful sister, the one beautiful thing in his world, would turn him into something ugly and unclean. Despite by the gods and men alike, if ever they knew his secret fault. All at once she cried out. He jumped to his feet before he knew what he was doing. "I just pricked my finger on the beastly needle," Bragawin said, grinning at him. "Don't look so alarmed, Garrow, but oh, here, I've gotten a drop of blood on your shirt. Blast it." The little red smear lay in the midst of a red interlaced band of spirals. "No one's ever going to notice that," Garrett said. "As long as it's not a bad omen, you're right enough. Doubtless you'll get more gore on it than this, and you get so filthy when you hunt, Garrow." "I won't wear it hunting until it starts to wear out. It'll be my best shirt, the last one you ever sewed for me." Garrett caught her hand and kissed the drop of blood away. Late that night, Garrett went out to the dark, silent ward and paced restlessly back and forth. In the moonlight, he could see the severed heads of old Zamorak glaring down at him with empty eye sockets. Once every dun and warrior's home would have been graced with such trophies, but some years past, the priests had seen visions starting that taking heads had come to displease the great bell, which is a god. Of all the lords around about, Dwayne was the last to defy the change. Garrett remembered the day when the priestess came to implore him to take the trophy down. A tiny lad then, Garrett hid behind his mother's skirts as Dwayne refused. roaring with laughter, saying that if the gods truly wanted it down, they'd make it rot soon enough. Chanting a ritual curse, the priest left defeated. I'm the curse, Garrett said to Samarak. I'm the curse the gods sent to our clan. He sat down on the ground and wept. The days passed slowly, long days of torment, until Garrett fled his sister's presence and rode to Blaine on the pretense of seeing his new betrothed. And Blaine is Rodri. He and Blaine were more than friends. The year before, when they'd ridden to war together, they'd sworn an oath that they would fight at each other's side until both were dead or both were victorious. And they had sealed that oath with drops of their own blood. In his blood-sworn friend's soothing company, Garrett spent a pleasant pair of days drinking at Blaine's hearth, hunting out in his forest preserve, or riding aimlessly across the lands with the war band behind them. Garrett envied Blade for having a war band. He was determined to get one of his own. The 10 horses he'd received in Yossela's dowry would be a splendid start, and soon Bragawin's royal marriage would bring wealth to the Falcon, a blood price for sorts, but too small to compensate for losing her. On the third day, late in the afternoon, Garrett and Blade rode out alone. Enjoying each other's silent company, they ambled through the fields until they reached a low rise that overlooked the meadows. Tended by a pair of boys and a dog, Blaine heard the white cattle with the rusty red ears grazing below. Let's hope there's no war this summer, Blaine said. What are you doing, turning into an old woman? I'm not ready to start sucking eggs yet, but I'll tell you somewhat I've never told any other man. There are times when I wish I'd been born a bard, singing about wars instead of fighting them. Thinking it a jest, Garen started to laugh, then stopped at the quiet seriousness in Blaine's eyes. All the way home he puzzled over it, remembering Blaine's calm courage in battle and wondering how any man would want to be a bard rather than a warrior. They returned to the dun at sunset, and as he dismounted, Garrett saw Brythu running out of the broch. My lord, the boy panted, I just got here. Your father's dying. Take the best horse in my stable, Blaine said. Break him if you have to. When he rode out, Garrett left the page behind so that he could make good speed. He galloped through the twilight, alternately trotting and galloping even when dark fell. Though the road lay treacherous in the pale moonlight, not for one moment did it occur to him that he might be thrown. All he could think of was his father dying without the last sight of his son, and Bragawin tending the dying alone. Whenever his horse stumbled, he would let it walk to rest, then spur it on again. At last he reached a small village on the edge of the lands. He banged on the tavern door until the tavernman came hurrying down in his nightshirt with a candle lantern in his hand. Can you change my horse? Garrett said. Lady Bragawin had the gray brought here to wait just for you. The gray was the fastest horse in the Falcon stable. Garrett switched saddles and bridle, flung the tavernman a coin, then kicked the gray to a gallop, plunging out of the candlelight and into the night-shrouded road. At last he saw the dun rising, a palisade dark against the starry sky. He spurred one last burst of speed out of the gray and galloped through the open gates. He dismounted as the chamberlain ran out of the broch. He still lives, Druid called out to him. I'll tend the horse. Garrett ran up the spiral staircase and down the hall to his father's chamber. Propped up on pillows, Dwyn was lying in bed, his face gray, his mouth slack as he fought for every breath. Bragawin sat beside him and clutched his hands in both of hers. He's home, Dasha said. Garrow's here. As Garrett walked over, Dwyn raised his head and searched for him with rheumy eyes. Dwyn tried to speak, then coughed, spitting up a slime of blood-tinged phlegm, slipping and glistening as his head fell back. He was dead. Garrett wiped the spittle off his father's mouth with the edge of the blanket, then closed his eyes and folded his arms across his chest. The chamberlain came in, glanced at the bed, then flung himself down on his knees at Garrett's feet, at the feet of the new falcon, head of the clan and its only hope. "My lord, I best send a page to King straight away. We've got to catch the wedding party before it leaves." "So we do. Get him on the way at dawn." It would take 3 days to get the message to Dundevry that Bregan's wedding would have to wait for a time of mourning. All at once he looked at his father's face. Garrett turned sick with self-loathing. He would have given anything to stop that marriage, anything but this. He threw his head back in Keene, crying after wordless cry, as if he could drive his thoughts away with sound. In the morning, the priests of Bel came from the temple to preside over the burial. Under their direction, Bragawin had her serving maid wash the body, dress it with Dwin's best court clothes, and lay it on a litter. While the servants dug the grave, Garrett groomed and saddled his father's best horse. The procession assembled out in the ward, servants carrying the litter, the priest just behind, then Garrett leading the horse. Supported by her maid and the chamberlain, Bragawin brought up the rear. The head priest gave Garrett a cold smile, then pointed to the lintel of the door. "That head comes down today, or I won't bury your father." Since he refused to order a servant to do such a hideous task, Garrett climbed the brock, working his way up the rough stone while the priest waited below with a basket. When Garrett reached the door, he clung to the lintel and examined the head. There was little left, a stretch of blackening skin over a skull, shreds of hair, a few cracked teeth. "Well and good, Samarick. Both you and your old enemy are going to be buried today." Garrett pulled his dagger and pried out the crumbling nails until the head dropped into the priest's basket with a sickening thud. The maidservant screamed, and the ward was silent except for the stamp and snort of the restless horse. The priest led the procession out and down around the hill to the small grove, the burial ground of the Falcon clan. At the sight of their mother's grave, Bragawin began to weep. The fresh grave lay beside it, and the deep trench some 8 feet wide and 10 feet long. When Garrett let the horse up, it pulled at its reins and danced in fear, as if it knew the weird in store for it. Garrett threw the reins to the waiting servant. As the horse tossed up his head, Garrett drew his sword and struck, killing it cleanly with one blow to the throat. With a gush of blood, the horse staggered forward, its legs buckling, and fell headlong into the grave. Garrett stepped back, unthinkingly wiped the sword blade clean on his brigha. For the rest of the ceremony, he stood there with the sword in his hand because he never thought to sheath it. At first, Garrett managed to cling to his warrior's calm, even when sobbing Bragawin poured milk and honey over the father's body. But the first spadeful of earth and the dark mud settling over his face broke him. Keening, he fell to his knees, tossed his head back, and sobbed that high, strange note over and over. Dimly, he felt Bragawin's hands on his shoulders. "Garrow, Garrow, Garrow, please stop, please." Garrett let her lead him away, leaning on her as if she were a warrior and he the last. She took him back to the hall and I lost my place, there was a bug. She took him back to the hall and shoved him into a chair by the hearth. He saw the priest come back, saw the fussing around Bragawin and talking in low voices. She came over to him with a tankard of ale in her hand. Reflexively, Garrett took it and sipped from it, then nearly threw it in her face. It reeked of medicinal herbs. "Drink it," Bragawin snapped. "Drink it down, Garrow. You've got to sleep." For her sake, Garrett choked the bitter stuff down. She took the empty tankard from his hands just as he fell asleep in his chair, drowning, or so he felt, in the warm sunlight. When he awoke, he was laying in his bed with a torch burning and an iron sconce on the wall. Blaine was sitting on the floor watching him. Ah, ye gods, Garrett, how did I sleep? It's just past sunset. We all rode out an hour ago. My mother and your betrothed wanted to be with Gwenny. Blaine got up and poured water from the clay pitcher on the windowsill. Garrett drank greedily to wash the bitter aftertaste of the drug out of his mouth. How long will you set the period of mourning? Blaine said. For my sake I'd say a year, but that would be cruel to our sisters, wouldn't it? I can go on mourning after they're both married. Say to the turning of the fall, then? Garrett nodded in agreement, thinking that Gwenny would be his for one more summer. Then he remembered why he would have the summer. Keening, he threw the clay cup against the wall so hard that it shattered. Blaine sat down beside him and grabbed him by the shoulders. Here, he's gone, Blaine. There's not more to do or say. Garrett rested his head against Blaine's chest and wept. I loved him like a brother, he thought. I'll thank all the gods that Gwenny's not marrying him. Prince Galeron's first week back at court was a long frustration. That's Nevin. With never a chance to speak to his father except in full formal court. He knew that he was holding back too, letting slip a chance here and there because his heart worried like a terrier with a rat at the question of marrying Bragawin or letting Blaine have her. Finally, he decided to enlist the aid of one ally he could always trust, his mother. On an afternoon so warm and balmy that it reminded him of Beltane was close at hand. Galeron left the city and rode to find the Queen's hawking party down by Loch Gwenercoated, the vast lake where three rivers came together west of Dunderry. The Queen and her attendants were having their noon meal at the southern shore in their bright dresses. The serving women and maidservants looked like flowers scattered through the grass. Queen Yelena sat in their midst. A young page dressed in white stood behind her with the Queen's favorite little Merlin on his wrist. Off to one side, the manservants tended the horses and the other hawks. When Galeron dismounted, the Queen waved him over an impatient flick of her hand. I've hardly seen you since you rode home, Yelena said. Are you well? By all means, what makes you think I am not? You've been brooding over somewhat, I can always tell. The Queen turned to her women. Go down to the lake shore, such like, all of you. Leave us. The women sprang up like birds taking flight and ran off, laughing and calling to one another. The page followed more slowly, chirping to the hawk to keep it calm. Yelena watched them go with small, satisfied nod. For all that she had 4 grown sons, she was a beautiful woman still, with large dark eyes, a slender face, and only a few streaks of gray in her chestnut hair. She reached into the basket beside her, brought out a piece of sweetbread, and handed it to Galeron. My thanks. Tell me somewhat, Mother. When you first came to court, did the other women envy your beauty? Of course. Are you thinking about your betrothed? Just that. I'm beginning to think you were right to doubt my choice. Now's a fine time for that when you've already pledged your vow to the poor child. What son ever listens to his mother until it's too late? Yelena gave him an indulgent smile. Galeron nibbled on the sweetbread and considered strategies. You know, Yelena said, there's not a lass alive who wouldn't want to be known as the most beautiful woman in all of Devery, but it's a harsh weird in its own way. Your little Gwenny never had the education I had either. She's such a trusting little soul. Just that. I spoke with Lady Rada of the Boar about the matter too. When I went with Garrett for his betrothal, Lord Blaine of the Boar is much enamored of the lass. Indeed. Does this mean trouble coming? It doesn't, but only because Blaine is an honorable man. It's odd truly, most lords care not about their wives one way or the other, just so long as they bear sons. Great beauty can act on the roughest lord like Dwemer, Elena smiled briefly, or on a prince. Galron winced at her unfortunate choice of imagery. What are you scheming, Elena went on, leaving Gwenny to Blaine and finding another wife? Well, somewhat like that. There's one small difficulty to the plan. I still love her in my way. Love may be a luxury that a prince can't afford. I don't remember Blaine well from his few visits at court. Is he like his father? As different as mead from mud. Then that's one blessing. I'm sure that if his father hadn't been killed in that hunting accident, he'd be plotting against the king right now. Elena glanced away, sincerely troubled. The Devery kingship was a risky thing. The lords and the tyrants remembered well in the old days of the dawn time. Kings were elected from among the fellow nobles, and families held the throne only as long as their heirs held the respect of the lords. Under the pressure of colonization in the new kingdom, that custom died away hundreds of years before, but it was far from unknown for nobility to organize a rebellion against the unpopular king in order to replace him with a better one. Lady Rada assured me that Blaine will hold loyal, Galron said. Indeed, well, I respect his opinion. You truly don't want to give Bragawin up, do you? I don't know. Galron tossed the remains of the bread into the grass. I truly don't know. Here's someone else you might think about. Your eldest brother has always been far too fond of lasses as it is. All at once, Galron found himself standing, his hand on his sword hilt. I'd kill him if he laid one hand on my Gwenny. My apologies, mother, but I'd kill him. Her face pale, Elena rose and caught his arm. Galron, let go of the hilt and calm yourself. Think about the marriage carefully, Elena said, her voice shaking. I beg you, think carefully. I will, and my apologies. Her talk with the prince seemed to have spoiled the queen's pleasure in her hawking, because she called her servants to her and announced they were returning to the city. At that time, Dundevery was confined to a low rise about a mile from the marshy shores of Loch Grenrockadid, ringed with stone walls that lay on both sides of the rushing river, which was spanned by 2 stone bridges, as well as 2 defensible archers in the city walls. Clustered inside were round stone houses scattered along randomly curving streets that sheltered about 20,000 people. Hold on, there's a bug bugging me. I gotta take care of this. Let me see. At the time, Dundevery was confined to a low rise about a mile from the marshy shores of Loch Gwendolyn. Ringed with stone walls, it lay on both sides of the rushing river, which spanned by 2 stone bridges, as well as 2 defensible arches to the city walls. Clustered inside were round stone houses scattered along randomly curving streets that sheltered about 20,000 people. At either end of the city rose 2 small hills. The southern one bore the great temple of Bel, the palace of the high priest of the kingdom, and an oak grove. The northern hill held the royal compound, which had stood there in one form or another for 600 years. Galron's clan, the Wyverns, had been living on the royal hill for only about 48 years. Galron's grandfather, Adaric I, had ended a long period of anarchy by finally winning the war among the great clans over the kingship. Although the Wyvern was descended from a member of King Bran's original warband and thus entitled to be called a great clan, Adaric I had forged an alliance among the lesser clans, the merchants, and anyone else who support his claim to the throne, Although he'd been scorned for stooping so low, he'd also taken the victory. Kind of like the Trump stuff going on right now. Blech. As the Queen's party rode through the streets, the town folks bowed and cheered to her. No matter what they might have thought of her husband in private, they honestly loved Yelena, who endowed many a temple to give aid to the poor and who spoke up often for the poor man to make the king show him mercy. For all his thick-headedness, the king did know what treasure he had in his wife. She was the only person whose advice he would take and trust, at least when it suited him to do so. Galron's main hope lay in getting her to advise the king to let his third son leave court for the Dwemer. Soon he knew he would have to tell his mother the truth. A stone wall with the iron-bound gates ringed the bottom of the royal hill. Beyond was a grassy parkland where white, red-eared cattle grazed along the royal horses. Near the crest stood a second ring of walls sheltering a village within the city. The royal compound, the huts for the servants, sheds, stables, barracks, and the like. In the middle of this cluster and bustle rose the great rock of the Wyvern clan. The main building was a six-story tower. Around it clustered two or three stories. The main building was a six-story tower. Around it clustered three two-story half-towers like chicks nestled around a hen. In case of fighting, the Brock would be a slaughterhouse for the baffled enemy because the only way into the half-towers lay through the main one. Besides the king and his family, the Brock complex housed all the noble-born retainers of court and a virtual rabbit warden. Constant intrigues and scheming over power and the king's favor were a way of life not only for the retainers, but for the various princes and their wives. Getting out of the Brock had always been a consummate goal of Galron's life. As befitted a prince, Galron had a suite of rooms on the second floor of the main tower. His reception chamber took up a generous wedge of the round floor plan with a high beam ceiling, a stone hearth, and a polished wooden floor. On the wood panel walls hung fine tapestries from far-off lands of Bardic, gifts from various traders who hoped that the prince would speak to them to the king. Since he was honorable in his bribe-taking, Galron always dutifully spoke. The chamber was richly furnished with carved chests and cushioned chairs, and a table where stood between two bronze wyverns his greatest treasure, 7 books. When Galron first learned to read, the king was furious, raging that letters were no fit thing for a man, but in his usual stubborn way, Galron had preserved until now. After some 4 years of study, he could read almost as well as a scribe. To avoid the bustle and clamor of the formal dinner in the great hall, Galron dined privately in his chamber that night. He did, however, receive a guest after the meal to share a silver goblet of mead, Gorbert Maddock of Galslock, in whose jurisdiction lay the lands of the Falcon and the Boar. Although below members of the royal family, of course, the rank of Gorbert was the highest in the kingdom, and the title went back to ancient times. In the Gaulish homeland, the Dawn-time tribes elected magistrates called Vergobreti to administer their laws and to speak for the wartime assemblies. Generally, the Vergobreti were chosen from the noble-born, and at about the time that word became Gorbert in their new land of Devry, the position began to pass from father to son. Since a man who made judgments in disputed booty was in good position to build up his power, in time the Gorberts became great, wealthy, and in possession of small armies to enforce their legal rulings on the tyrants and lords beneath them. One last remnant of the Dawn-time survived, however, in the council of electors who, if Gorbert's line died out, would choose the noble plan to succeed it. Thus every Gorbert in the kingdom was forced to reckon with, and Galron fussed over Maddox as if he were a prince himself, offering him the cushioned chair, pouring him mead with his own hand, and sending the page away so they could speak privately. The object of these attentions merely smiled benignly. A solid man with a thick streak of gray hair in his raven dark hair, Maddox cared more for the fine horses than honors, and for the good battle more than the rank. That night he was in a jesting mood, pledging the prince with his goblet of mead in a mock solemnity. "To your wedding, my prince," Maddox said. "For a man who doesn't say much, you're a sly one. Fancy you're nipping in and getting the most beautiful lass in the kingdom." I was rather surprised she accepted me. No one could ever call me the most beautiful, lad. "Oh, don't give yourself short value." Brangwyn sees beyond the lad's face, which is more than many a lass does. Maddox had a swallow of mead long enough to burn an ordinary drinker's throat. "I don't mind saying that every man in the kingdom is going to envy you your wedding night, or have you already claimed your rights as her betrothed?" "I haven't. I had no desire to set her brother against me just for one night in her bed." Although Galron was merely speaking casually, Maddox turned troubled, watching him over the rim of the goblet. "Well," Galron went on, "how do you think Garrett would have taken it if I bedded his sister under his roof?" "He's a strange lad." Maddox looked idly away. "He's been out there alone on the edge of that cursed forest too much. But he's a good lad withal. I rode with him in that last rebellion against your father. By the hell of ice itself, our Garrow can fight. I've never seen a man swing a sword as well as he does, and that's not idle praise, my prince, but my considered judgment." "Then coming from you, that's high praise indeed." Maddox nodded absently and had another sip of mead. When he spoke again, it was to change the subject to legal doings of the Gorbert done, and he kept it there. It was late and Maddox long gone. I think I'll leave off there. That's it for Chapter 2, Part B. Thanks for listening.